bumped into John Boanna. And he said, "Do you want to get involved in a Sunday newspaper?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you're black." I said, "All right."
Unusually for the left, News on Sunday was determined to be non-sectarian and invited Stalinists, Trotskyites, libertarians and the non-aligned to work together for the greater good. Mike Power was a Fleet Street print worker who'd been active in the trade union movement for many years.
They spotted me, as it were, because I was involved in the campaign for press freedom, and I was a member of the Communist Party, and they asked me to come along as a kind of an advisor helper.
I didn't have a background in the media. You know, I was a youth worker. It was more to do with playing a small part in the development of a newspaper which could hopefully have an impact on dismissal of Margaret Thatcher at the time.
This group of people were to be called the Founders. They owned what was known as the Golden Share, which meant they had final say over the hiring and firing of the editor and could oppose any change in ownership of the paper.
Basically, sitting on a table with the Founders was like sitting around the tables of the founding fathers of America, if I can put it so boldly. And that is that they were from all various, they were from different backgrounds, a variety of educations and skills, but all had a common theme, and that common theme was wanting to change Britain for the better. The paper will support people fighting to free their countries from foreign occupation, from racist regimes, or from any form of dictatorship.
News on Sunday recognises that Britain is a society based on the unequal ownership of wealth, prosperity and power,
And will seek to inform the readers of such inequalities, their causes and effects.
One of the most high-profile and violent industrial disputes of the mid-80s was Wapping. Rupert Murdoch had sacked 5,000 of his workers and moved production of The Sun, The Times and The Sunday Times to a new high-tech plant in Wapping in East London. Sacked workers picketed the new plant for many months, and journalists who refused to make the move to Wapping set up a strike newspaper called the Wapping Post. Keith Sutton was the editor.
Keith had been, was one of the refuseniks, the Wapping refuseniks, the people who wouldn't go down there. He'd been working at the Sunday Times on that occasion. And Keith became editor of the Wapping Post, which was started by the print unions. It was a sort of campaigning paper which was pounding the Murdoch press.
We would have things like page 3 stunner with the female riot cop carrying a truncheon with page 3 stunner over it. Then we'd have page 5 shy guy, and the policeman would have his numbers off, you know. So it was kind of using humour to show some pretty serious stuff. And I sort of put it all together, and it was a great success. Great success. But here we were in the 8th or 9th month of this horrific dispute, and you know, the reality of defeat was beginning to appear, I suppose, at that time. And so I would have been thinking about, you know, what was I going to be doing next?
In August 1986, News on Sunday advertised for an editor who would report to John Pilger, the editor-in-chief. With his radical credentials and heroic status as editor of the Wapping Post, Keith Sutton seemed the ideal candidate.
Keith got the job because he reassured us that he would produce a paper that fitted with the dream.
I asked where he was from. When I was told he was the editor of Wapping Post, I was delighted, because I thought the Wapping Post was a great paper, and Keith Sutton was going to unleash an unholy war in the name of decency. And I thought, that'll do me. That will do me.
You had edited the initial dummy. Did you think that maybe you should be the editor?
I think in my heart of hearts, I thought I should be the editor. But, you know, I don't think that anybody suggested it, and I never pushed myself forward. But I guess I wished that I'd been asked.
In the first of a series of ill-fated decisions informed by left-wing dogma, News on Sunday took the unexpected decision to base itself not in Fleet Street, but 200 miles away in Whitworth Street in Manchester.
The idea was that the newspaper would, as well as being radical and campaigning, would also represent a different viewpoint, wouldn't be so London-based. The idea that there are a lot of people outside London who are actually quite annoyed by the way their news is all from a London perspective. It sounded like a great idea.
It was part of the overall philosophy, I think, of devolution and not being sort of London-focused and things. There was a strong sort of idea of sort of regionality that a lot of the people wanted to introduce into the paper.
To actually base a national publication of that kind with its office in Manchester made no sense at all. When the whole media world was in London, when politics that mattered nationally was in London and so on, really didn't make sense at all. For me, it was a key error, although in the end I went along with it because one of the things I learnt as a member of the Communist Party was how to function in a system of democratic centralism where once a decision's taken, if you're defeated, then you go along with it.
With 4 months to go till launch, the process of recruiting staff began.
I thought Alan Aylan knew everybody in the world, so we were going to get the best. You know?
The paper needed experienced journalists, not enthusiastic amateurs. And I was using my contacts and friendships with people to persuade them to come over.
He gave me this list of people I can remember fairly early on once we got started, who he thought would be great to have on board. You know, one or two of them I'd heard of, I knew. A lot of them I didn't. Some of them were in New York. Some of them were authors of books on Northern Ireland, I think. He was going off to Australia to make a film. He said he'd be filming for, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months, and he would be in touch from Australia, really, and left me to get on with recruiting.
Hindus have the Ganges, Australians have their beach. And this is Bondi, my beach.
There was a very idealistic recruitment policy. They were trying to adopt best practice. And so the decision was made to have a very kind of fair and egalitarian recruitment process.
Mostly in journalism, you get jobs in a very nepotistic and old boy network type of way. So this was quite a radical departure.
Not many black people at that time worked in Fleet Street because the journalists that I knew didn't have any contacts on Fleet Street. So it was very, very difficult to get into those newspapers. When News on Sunday started, what it did, which was kind of revolutionary at the time, was that they advertised jobs.
An extraordinary advert appeared in The Guardian. It just said, "We need journalists," or something like that. It wasn't very specific.
You had everybody and their dog writing in. You had people who were writing in because the politics sounded good. You had people writing in just because they wanted a job. This was a time of very high unemployment.
We had every person who'd ever had a left-wing thought in his head applying. You know, every student, every quasi-journalist, everybody who seemed to be a member of any group with more than 8 people in it applied to News on Sunday.
But they were arriving in sacks. There weren't the trained professionals in place to sift through and assess these applications for jobs that weren't specified. So we picked out the ones that had been done on the Amstrad, and we binned the rest.
There are people out there who probably detest me to this day for never answering. I'm sorry, we never got to hear of you. I mean, we were avalanched.
We did a lot of encouraging people from unrepresented groups, like we advertised in the black press, as well as advertising in the straight press, the Press Gazette and all the rest of it. And then I got in touch with a lot of local ethnic minority groups, and I got in touch with the disablement resettlement officers about means to encourage people with disabilities to apply for jobs.
Now, the problem with that really is that in a creative business, you can only do that up to a certain point, because you need to go looking for people who have certain abilities in certain areas. You know, I mean, columnists whose names are known to the public.
You were not going to get a large proportion of women from ethnic minorities as highly qualified sub-editors. You just weren't going to. You certainly weren't going to get design sub-editors who were either women from ethnic minorities and or disabled. Forget it. No way.
Well, on the disablement side, I was strongly advised that one of the best things to do was to have a critical mass of people with the same kind of disability, because they could then communicate with each other and share their experiences together. So we made the post room a room for deaf people. And they looked after all the mailings, and of course they could drive, because deaf people can drive perfectly well, and so they did all the distribution of the papers. And I think that was very, very successful, because they all could sign and talk to each other, and we always got signers in if there was a meeting along with people who were not deaf. And there was a sort of camaraderie about that. News on Sunday is opposed to all forms of sexism, racism and all discrimination which denies the capabilities and potential of the individual.
News on Sunday will express its commitment to anti-racism and anti-sexism both in the employment practices and in its news and feature coverage.
It will reflect the multicultural composition of British society.
Best-selling novelist Val McDermott was an experienced tabloid journalist at the time. She applied for the job of news editor.
I do think that one of the mistakes that News on Sunday made at several points in the editorial appointment process was to make decisions based on politics rather than ability. And I know that sounds like sour grapes, but you know, I had far more practical experience than Colton Lee, who was appointed as news editor, who had never worked for a national newspaper. But, you know, he was black, and we didn't have very many black people in editorial, so I think that was something that informed the decision, you know, white lesbian, black man, tough call.
Do you think you did have the experience to run as you say, a frantic national news desk from start-up?
Did I have the experience? I would say, did I have the experience to run a frantic news desk? I would say, in a conventional sense, no. But given that my whole journalistic experience had been about looking at the news and reporting, you know, news in a very different way, reporting news stories or covering news stories from a perspective that was not the norm, I was probably more experienced than most of the other people working on the paper, actually.
Everybody seemed to end up with a job they hadn't done before. Was there some notion that if you wanted to do something in a different way, it's a good idea to put people in posts who haven't done it before?
No, not at all. In fact, I think that's kind of a bit unfair. Actually, where people had to have a particular knowledge base, I think they had a particular knowledge base.
I was head of personnel and equal opportunities.
And had you done that job anywhere before?
No.
Had you ever been foreign editor on a national paper before?
I'd never been foreign editor of any national newspaper.
Did you have any experience of working on a tabloid?
No, I'd never worked on a national tabloid.
Had you ever worked on a tabloid before?
No.
And had you ever worked in personnel before?
No.
Had you ever been editor-in-chief of a national newspaper?
No.
Had you ever been sales director on a national newspaper?
Never.
Had you been the editor of a national newspaper before?
No.
You said you knew how to do spreadsheets, but you'd never actually worked within a company, looking after the finances of a company before in that way?
No.
So you'd never had a job in computing before?
No.
Had you actually had a job in marketing ever before?
No, but again,
It's the sort of skill you pick up.
You became the chief executive.
I became the chief executive.
Was that a job